The story of Constantinople begins with a decision made by one man over 1100 years before its fall. In the year 330 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine I looked at his vast empire and saw a problem. Rome, the ancient capital, sat in the west, but the wealthiest, most cultured, most strategically important provinces were all in the east: Greece, Egypt, Syria, Anatolia. These were the lands that mattered. Constantine made a revolutionary choice. He would build a new capital, a new Rome, and he would build it at the crossroads of the world, at the place where Europe meets Asia, where the Mediterranean meets the Black Sea. He chose an ancient Greek city called Byzantium. It sat on a triangular peninsula, surrounded on two sides by water. To the south was the Sea of Marmara. To the north was a magnificent natural harbor called the Golden Horn. To the west, the only land approach, he would build walls. The emperor poured the resources of the entire Roman Empire into his new city. He brought in architects, engineers, and artists from across the known world. He looted ancient temples and cities for their most beautiful statues and columns to adorn his new capital. He built a magnificent palace, a massive hippodrome for chariot races, grand public baths, forums, and wide colonnaded streets. And at the heart of it all, he built the Church of the Holy Apostles, and later his successors would build the breathtaking Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, with its impossible dome that seemed to float on light. When Constantine dedicated his city in 330 AD, he proclaimed it Nova Roma, New Rome. But the world knew it by another name, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The location was perfect. Every trade route between east and west passed through Constantinople. Ships carrying silk from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt, all stopped here. The city grew rich beyond measure. Its markets were filled with goods from 3 continents. Its streets were paved with marble. Its palaces glittered with mosaics of gold. It became the largest, wealthiest, most advanced city in Europe, and remained so for the next 1,000 years. But what truly made Constantinople impregnable were its walls. The first set, built by Constantine, were impressive, but in the year 413, Emperor Theodosius II ordered the construction of a new, far more massive set of fortifications. These Theodosian walls were an engineering marvel, a triple line of defense. First came a wide moat, 60 feet across and 20 feet deep. Behind that was an outer wall, 25 feet high. Behind that was a broad terrace where defenders could mass. And behind that rose the inner wall, 40 feet high and 15 feet thick, studded with 96 massive towers. For over 1,000 years, these walls held. The Huns came and were turned away. The Persians laid siege and failed. The Arabs attacked multiple times and were always repulsed. An army could smash itself against these walls for years and never breach them. Constantinople was the unconquerable city, the queen of the world. But walls, no matter how strong, are only as good as the men defending them. And by the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire that had once ruled the entire Mediterranean was dying. Its territory had shrunk to little more than the city itself and a few scattered outposts. A new power had risen in the east, the Ottoman Turks. young, aggressive, and determined to take the greatest prize in the world. And they had a new weapon, something that could do what no army in 1,000 years had managed. They had gunpowder.
In February of 1451, a young man ascended to the throne of the Ottoman Empire. His name was Mehmed II. He was only 19 years old, but he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Mehmed was not the typical Ottoman Sultan. He spoke 6 languages fluently, including Greek and Latin. He studied ancient history obsessively, particularly the campaigns of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. He surrounded himself with scholars, engineers, and artists. But beneath this cultured exterior was a will of absolute iron and a single burning obsession. He wanted Constantinople. Previous sultans had dreamed of taking the great city. His own father had tried and failed. But Mehmed was different. He was not going to rely on traditional siege tactics. He was going to use science, engineering, and a weapon that would change warfare forever. Immediately upon taking the throne, Mehmed began his preparations. First, he ensured peace with his other neighbors. He signed treaties with the Venetians, with the Hungarians, with every Christian power that might interfere. He wanted no distractions. Then he began building. On the European shore of the Bosporus, directly across from an older Turkish fortress on the Asian side, Mehmed ordered the construction of a massive new fortress. It was called Rumeli Hisari, the fortress of the Roman lands. Its sole purpose was to control the narrow strait leading to the Black Sea, cutting off Constantinople from reinforcements or supplies from the north. The Byzantines watched in horror as the fortress rose in just 4 months. They protested, but Mehmed ignored them. When the fortress was complete, he stationed massive cannons in its towers and issued a command. Any ship trying to pass without permission would be sunk. But the fortress was just the beginning. Mehmed heard of a brilliant but troubled Hungarian engineer named Urban. This man had approached the Byzantine emperor, offering him to build powerful cannons, but the emperor, with an almost empty treasury, could not afford to pay him. Mehmed could. He summoned Urban to his court and asked him a simple question. Could he build a cannon powerful enough to smash the walls of Constantinople? Urban replied that he could build a cannon powerful enough to smash the walls of Babylon itself. Mehmed gave him unlimited resources and told him to begin. What Urban created was a monster, the largest cannon ever built. It was over 27 feet long. Its bronze barrel was 8 inches thick. It could fire a stone ball weighing 1,200 pounds over a mile. In February of 1451, a young man ascended to the throne of the Ottoman Empire. His name was Mehmed II. He was only 19 years old, but he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Mehmed was not the typical Ottoman Sultan. He spoke 6 languages fluently, including Greek and Latin. He studied ancient history obsessively, particularly the campaigns of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. He surrounded himself with scholars, engineers, and artists. But beneath this cultured exterior was a will of absolute iron and a single burning obsession. He wanted Constantinople. Previous sultans had dreamed of taking the great city. His own father had tried and failed. But Mehmed was different. He was not going to rely on traditional siege tactics. He was going to use science, engineering, and a weapon that would change warfare forever. Immediately upon taking the throne, Mehmed began his preparations. First, he ensured peace with his other neighbors. He signed treaties with the Venetians, with the Hungarians, with every Christian power that might interfere. He wanted no distractions. Then he began building. On the European shore of the Bosporus, directly across from an older Turkish fortress on the Asian side, Mehmed ordered the construction of a massive new fortress. It was called Rumeli Hisari, the fortress of the Roman lands. Its sole purpose was to control the narrow strait leading to the Black Sea, cutting off Constantinople from reinforcements or supplies from the north. The Byzantines watched in horror as the fortress rose in just 4 months. They protested, but Mehmed ignored them. When the fortress was complete, he stationed massive cannons in its towers and issued a command. Any ship trying to pass without permission would be sunk. But the fortress was just the beginning. Mehmed heard of a brilliant but troubled Hungarian engineer named Urban. This man had approached the Byzantine emperor, offering him to build powerful cannons, but the emperor, with an almost empty treasury, could not afford to pay him. Mehmed could. He summoned Urban to his court and asked him a simple question. Could he build a cannon powerful enough to smash the walls of Constantinople? Urban replied that he could build a cannon powerful enough to smash the walls of Babylon itself. Mehmed gave him unlimited resources and told him to begin. What Urban created was a monster, the largest cannon ever built. It was over 27 feet long. Its bronze barrel was 8 inches thick. It could fire a stone ball weighing 1,200 pounds over a mile. When it was tested, the sound of its firing could be heard 10 miles away. The ground shook. The ball it fired buried itself 6 feet into the earth. Mehmed looked at this weapon and smiled. He ordered dozens more cannons to be cast, smaller than the great monster, but still devastatingly powerful. While the cannons were being built, Mehmed assembled his army. The core was the Janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman Empire. These were soldiers taken as boys from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to be the most disciplined and
Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI watched the Ottoman army approach with a heavy heart. He knew his city was doomed unless a miracle occurred. He also knew that miracles were in short supply. Constantine was 58 years old. He had ruled the dying Byzantine Empire for only 4 years, inheriting a realm that was little more than the city itself. He was a good man, pious and brave, but he had been handed an impossible situation. His treasury was nearly empty. His population had shrunk from hundreds of thousands at the empire's height to perhaps 50,000 souls still living within the walls. And his army was a shadow of the legendary Byzantine legions of old. When he called for a census of able-bodied men who could fight, the number he received was devastating: 7,000. That was all. 7,000 men to defend 14 miles of walls against 100,000 enemies. Some of those defenders were Greeks, citizens of the city who took up arms to defend their homes. Others were foreign soldiers of fortune who had come seeking glory or pay. But the emperor's greatest asset was a small contingent of professional warriors from the West. Fewer than 700 men, but they were experts. One of the most important of these was a Genoese soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani. He was one of the finest military engineers in Europe, an expert in siege warfare. When news of the Ottoman threat reached Genoa, Giustiniani had volunteered to help defend Constantinople. He arrived in January with 2 ships carrying 700 well-armed and experienced soldiers. Emperor Constantine welcomed him like a savior. He immediately placed Giustiniani in command of the defense of the land walls, the most critical and vulnerable section. Giustiniani quickly assessed the situation. The walls, though ancient, were still formidable, but they were in poor repair. Sections had crumbled over the centuries and had been patched with rubble and mortar rather than properly rebuilt. The defenders lacked gunpowder weapons. While the Ottomans had dozens of cannons, the Byzantines had only a handful of small, outdated bombards. Giustiniani set to work. He organized the defenders into shifts, ensuring the walls were manned at all hours. He had barrels filled with earth placed behind the weakest sections of wall to absorb the impact of cannonballs. He built wooden stockades to block any breaches. He drilled the defenders relentlessly, preparing them for the assault he knew was coming. Constantine did everything in his power to help. He sent desperate messages to the West, to the Pope, to Venice, to Genoa, begging for aid. He promised to reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches, to submit to Rome's authority, if only the West would send an army to save his city. Some help came, some ships, a few hundred soldiers, but nothing like the crusade he needed. Inside the city, morale was fragile. They knew they were vastly outnumbered. They knew the Ottomans had weapons that could smash their walls, but they also had faith. Faith in their walls, which had never fallen. Faith in the Virgin Mary, whom they believed was the special protector of Constantinople, and faith in their emperor, who walked the walls every day, speaking words of encouragement to his soldiers, sharing their rations, refusing any comfort they did not have. As the Ottoman army appeared on the horizon in early April, the defenders took their positions. The gates were sealed. The food stores were inventoried. Precious relics and icons were brought out from the churches and paraded along the walls to bless the defenders. The siege of Constantinople had begun, the final siege, the siege that would decide the fate of the city and, unknowingly, the fate of the world.
April 6, 1453. The Ottoman army completed its encirclement of Constantinople. Mehmed positioned his forces with precision. The elite janissaries and the heaviest cannons were placed opposite the weakest section of the walls, the central portion known as the Mesotikion. This is where he would strike. The siege began not with a dramatic assault, but with the methodical work of the cannons. Every day, starting at dawn, the massive guns would roar. The great bombard that Urban had built could only be fired 7 times a day. Each firing required hours of cooling and careful reloading.
but when it spoke, the entire city trembled. The defenders watched in horror as the huge stone balls arced through the air and crashed into the ancient walls. Each impact sent up a cloud of dust and shattered stone. The outer wall began to crack and crumble. The defenders worked frantically every night to repair the damage, filling the gaps with earth, stones, and wooden beams. But every day the cannons destroyed their work. But Mehmed had a problem. His great cannon, for all its power, was also its own worst enemy. The immense heat and force of firing caused cracks in its bronze barrel. After only a few weeks, the monster cannon exploded, killing its crew and shattering into useless fragments. Urban, the brilliant engineer who had created it, was killed in the blast. Mehmed mourned the loss, but ordered the bombardment to continue with his dozens of smaller cannons. Emperor Constantine knew he could not win a war of attrition. He had too few men, too little ammunition, too little food. He needed to break the siege, to force Mehmed to withdraw. His only hope was the sea. Constantinople's location gave it one great advantage. The Golden Horn, the natural harbor on the city's northern side, was protected by a massive chain. This enormous boom of iron links stretched across the mouth of the harbor from Constantinople to the Genoese trading colony of Galata on the opposite shore. No ship could pass it. As long as the Golden Horn remained secure, the Byzantines only had to defend the land walls and the South Sea Wall. If the Ottomans gained access to the Golden Horn, they could attack from the north as well, spreading the defenders impossibly thin. Mehmed knew this. On April 20th, he attempted his first major assault. He ordered his fleet, over 100 ships, to break the chain and enter the Golden Horn. But the Byzantine and Genoese ships defending the chain were better sailors. They used Greek fire, the legendary Byzantine weapon, a liquid that burned on water. They destroyed several Ottoman ships and drove the rest back. The chain held. Inside the city, there was celebration. Perhaps they could survive after all. Mehmed was furious. He had been repulsed, humiliated in front of his army. He returned to his tent and summoned his engineers. He gave them a problem to solve. If the chain could not be broken, he would bypass it entirely. He ordered them to build a road. What happened next was one of the astounding logistical feats in military history. Working through the night, Ottoman engineers constructed a wooden track greased with animal fat. This track ran from the Bosphorus, up and over the hills behind Galata, and down into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain entirely. On April 22nd, while the defenders slept, Mehmed ordered 70 ships to be dragged over land on this road. By dawn, the defenders on the walls looked north in shock and disbelief. 70 Ottoman ships were now floating in the Golden Horn, behind their defenses. The impossible had happened. They were now surrounded.
The appearance of the Ottoman fleet in the Golden Horn sent a wave of despair through Constantinople. Now the defenders had to man the northern walls as well as the land walls, stretching their already thin forces to the breaking point. Inside the emperor's palace, a fierce debate erupted. Constantine called a council of his advisors, military commanders, and the leaders of the foreign contingents. The question was stark. Should they attempt one last desperate gambit to destroy the Ottoman fleet in the Golden Horn, or should they conserve their strength for defending the walls? Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, argued for caution. The defenders could not afford to lose men in a risky naval attack. Their only chance was to hold the walls until relief arrived from the west. Every day they survived was another day for a crusade to be organized. But others argued that morale was collapsing. The people were terrified. They needed a victory, something to give them hope. A bold nighttime attack on the Ottoman ships using fire ships might destroy the enemy fleet and restore the balance. The debate grew heated. Accusations were thrown. The Genoese and Venetians, traditional rivals, argued bitterly. Some accused others of cowardice, some of recklessness. Through it all, Emperor Constantine sat in silence, listening, weighing. Finally, he made his decision. They would attack. A small fleet of fire ships would attempt to destroy the Ottoman vessels in a midnight raid. It was risky, but doing nothing was slow death. They needed to act. The attack was planned for April 28th. The Byzantines prepared their ships, loading them with flammable materials. The plan was simple. Row silently into the Golden Horn under cover of darkness, set the ships ablaze, and ram them into the packed Ottoman fleet. The resulting fire hopefully would spread, destroying most of the enemy vessels. But the plan required absolute secrecy. The Ottomans could not know it was coming, and this is where the plan fell apart. Someone talked. Perhaps a deserter, perhaps a spy, perhaps a merchant from neutral Galata who saw profit in selling information. We do not know, but Mehmed learned of the attack. On the night of April 28th, the Byzantine fire ships rowed silently into the Golden Horn. They approached the Ottoman fleet, which appeared to be sleeping peacefully. The moment had come. The Byzantines lit their ships, preparing to ram the enemy fleet. And then, from the darkness, Ottoman cannons roared. The Turkish ships were not asleep. They were waiting. The entire shore erupted in gunfire and arrows. The Byzantine ships were caught completely exposed. Several were sunk immediately. The rest fled back to the safety of the chain. Their mission a complete failure. The next day, Mehmed ordered the captured Byzantine sailors impaled on stakes in view of the city walls. It was a message. Resistance was futile. Surrender or die. Inside Constantinople, the failed attack shattered morale. The last hope of breaking the siege was gone. The defenders returned to the grim task of manning the walls, repairing the damage from the daily cannon bombardment, and waiting for relief that never came, waiting for the final assault that everyone knew was inevitable, waiting for the end. As April turned to May, the bombardment intensified. Sections of the outer wall had collapsed entirely. The defenders piled rubble and barrels of earth behind the breaches, creating makeshift barricades, but they knew these would not hold against a determined assault. The question was no longer if the city would fall. The question was when, and how long they could make the Ottomans pay for every foot of ground.
While the cannons roared above ground, a different, silent battle was being fought beneath the walls of Constantinople. Mehmed had not put all his faith in gunpowder. He also employed an ancient siege tactic, mining. Ottoman engineers began digging tunnels under the walls.
The plan was to burrow beneath the foundations, shore up the tunnel with wooden beams, then fill the space with gunpowder and set it ablaze. When the support beams burned away, the tunnel would collapse, bringing down the wall above it, creating a breach. But the Byzantines had a secret weapon of their own, a Scottish engineer named Johannes Grant. Grant was an expert in siege warfare and countermining. When he heard the faint sounds of digging beneath the walls, he knew immediately what the Ottomans were doing. Grant organized teams of defenders to dig their own counter-tunnels. This was dangerous, claustrophobic work. Men crawled through narrow passages deep underground, listening for the sound of enemy digging. When they located an Ottoman tunnel, they would break through the wall separating them and attack the Turkish miners in brutal hand-to-hand combat in the darkness. For weeks, this underground war raged. Grant's teams successfully discovered and destroyed multiple Ottoman tunnels. They would break into the enemy mine, kill the workers, then collapse the tunnel or fill it with smoke to suffocate anyone inside. It was a game of mouse and cat played in total darkness, and Grant was winning. Mehmed was frustrated. His mines were failing. His cannons were making progress, but it was slow. Morale in his army was beginning to waver. Some of his commanders whispered that perhaps Constantinople truly was under divine protection. Perhaps the city could not be taken. On May 24, 1453, Mehmed called a council of war. He presented his commanders with a choice. They could continue the siege indefinitely, bleeding men and resources, or they could launch one final, all-out assault. If it succeeded, the city was theirs. If it failed, they would lift the siege and go home. His commanders were divided. Some argued for continued siege. The city was starving. Given time, it would surrender without a costly assault. Others argued that the army was losing morale. If they did not attack soon, the siege would collapse on its own. Several of Mehmed's most senior advisors recommended withdrawing. They argued that taking Constantinople was impossible, that the city's walls and divine protection made it impregnable. Mehmed listened to all of them. Then he stood and delivered a speech that would become legendary. He reminded them of the glory that awaited. Constantinople was the richest city in the world. Its treasures were beyond imagination. Islamic prophecy said that one day a righteous army would take the city of Constantine. That prophecy would be fulfilled by him, by them, by this army. They would be remembered forever. He gave his commanders 3 days. Prepare for a final, total assault. Every man, every ship, every cannon would attack simultaneously. They would not stop until they were inside the city or until every man was dead. The date was set, May 29th, 1453. Inside Constantinople, the defenders watched as the Ottoman camp erupted in activity. They could see the preparations. They knew what was coming. Emperor Constantine addressed his men. He thanked them for their bravery. He released any foreign soldiers who wished to leave. None did. Then he asked them to prepare themselves, to make peace with God, to confess their sins, because in 3 days the final battle would begin, and they would either hold the walls or die trying. The city descended into a strange, somber calm. Churches were filled day and night with people praying.
Icons were carried through the streets. The emperor walked the walls, speaking quietly with his soldiers, sharing their last meals. The defenders sharpened their weapons and waited for the night before the final assault. May 28th, 1453, was unlike any other in the long history of Constantinople. As darkness fell, a strange silence settled over both camps. The Ottoman cannons, which had roared every day for nearly 2 months, went quiet. Mehmed had ordered a ceasefire. He wanted his guns cold and ready for the morning. He wanted his men rested for the battle to come. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine ordered a final, desperate act of faith. Every holy icon, every sacred relic that Constantinople possessed was brought out from the churches. The Hodegetria, the most venerated icon of the Virgin Mary, said to have been painted by Saint Luke himself, was carried in solemn procession around the entire circuit of the walls. Thousands of citizens joined the procession. Greeks, Italians, soldiers, priests, women, children, everyone who could walk followed the sacred icon through the darkened streets, singing hymns and prayers. They believed that the Virgin Mary was the special protector of Constantinople. Surely she would not abandon them now. But as the procession wound through the streets, something terrible happened. The icon, being carried on the shoulders of priests, suddenly slipped and fell to the ground. The crowd gasped in horror. It was a terrible omen. Before they could recover it, a sudden, unseasonable thunderstorm erupted. Rain fell in sheets. The streets turned to rivers. The procession dissolved into chaos. When the storm passed, a strange fog settled over the city, so thick that visibility dropped to a few feet. And then witnesses reported seeing a strange light in the dome of Hagia Sophia, glowing and then slowly fading into darkness. Ancient prophecy had said that the divine presence would remain in Hagia Sophia until the city's last day. Many believed they had just witnessed that presence departing. Fear swept through the city. People whispered that God had abandoned them, that the end had truly come. Some defenders quietly slipped away in the night, escaping by boat into the darkness, but most remained. Emperor Constantine spent the night making his final preparations. He attended a last service in Hagia Sophia, praying before the altar. He received communion. Then he returned to the walls. There he assembled his commanders and his household guard. He knew these were his final hours. He gave a short, moving speech. He thanked them for their loyalty. He apologized that he could not pay them what they deserved, that his treasury was empty. He told them that in a few hours they would face the full fury of the Ottoman army. Many of them would die, but they would die as free men, defending the last remnant of Rome. They would die with honor. Then he did something remarkable. He went to each of his commanders, Greek and Italian alike, and asked for their forgiveness for any offense he had ever given them. He embraced them. He told them he was honored to fight beside them. There were tears. Hardened soldiers wept openly. Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, knelt before the emperor and pledged to hold the walls or die trying. Constantine raised him up and kissed him on both cheeks. As midnight passed and the first hours of May 29th arrived, Constantine took his position on the walls at the Mesoteikion, the central section that had suffered the worst from the cannons, the section where the final assault would surely fall. He was surrounded by his household guard and by Giustiniani's best soldiers. He drew his sword and looked out into the darkness. Somewhere out there, in the Ottoman camp, 100,000 men were preparing to attack. Constantine whispered a prayer. He gripped his sword tighter, and he waited for the dawn.
At 1:30 a.m. on May 29th, 1453, the silence was shattered. Every cannon the Ottomans possessed fired simultaneously. The noise was indescribable, a wall of sound and fury that seemed to tear the very air apart. The cannonballs smashed into the walls, into the breaches, into the makeshift barricades the defenders had erected. And then, from out of the darkness, came the first wave. Mehmed had organized his assault in 3 phases. The first wave would be the Bashi Bazouks, irregular troops, volunteers and conscripts. They were expendable. Their job was not to take the walls, but to exhaust the defenders, to fill the moat with their bodies, to force the Byzantines to use up their arrows and gunpowder. They came on in a screaming, chaotic mass, thousands of men carrying ladders, swords, axes, rushing forward through the darkness toward the walls. The defenders met them with everything they had: arrows, crossbow bolts, stones, boiling oil, anything they could throw or drop. The carnage was immediate and terrible. The irregulars reached the moat and tried to cross it. Many drowned. Others made it across and threw their ladders against the outer wall. Byzantine defenders pushed the ladders away, sending screaming men falling backward onto the spikes and rubble below. But there were so many attackers that some made it to the top of the wall. There they were met by Greek and Italian soldiers in close combat. Swords clashed, men fell. For nearly 2 hours this first wave attacked. The defenders held, but the cost was terrible. They were exhausted. Their ammunition was running low. And then, just as the first wave began to falter, Mehmed sent in the second wave. These were the Anatolian Turks, professional soldiers, better equipped and better disciplined than the irregulars. They attacked with precision. Squads of archers provided covering fire, while assault teams rushed forward with scaling ladders. They focused their attack on the breaches in the wall, where the cannons had done the most damage. The fighting intensified. Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, was everywhere at once, directing the defense, plugging gaps in the line, leading counterattacks to throw the Turks back. Emperor Constantine fought beside his men, his imperial robes abandoned, wearing simple armor indistinguishable from any other defender. The Anatolian assault was fierce and prolonged. For another 2 hours the battle raged. The defenders were being pushed to their absolute limit. Men collapsed from exhaustion. The walls were slick with blood. The dead were piled so high that they formed obstacles, forcing the living to fight while standing on corpses. But still the walls held. The Byzantines fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they were defending their last refuge. Every foot of the Janissaries attacked with coordinated precision the defenders had never seen before.
While some units set up their scaling ladders and climbed, others provided withering covering fire. Ottoman archers, protected by shield bearers, fired volleys directly at the defenders on the walls, forcing them to duck behind the battlements. The Janissaries focused their main assault on the section of wall that had taken the most punishment from the cannons. Here, near the St. Romanus Gate, the wall had collapsed in several places. The Byzantines had filled these breaches with barrels of earth, wooden stockades, and rubble, creating makeshift walls. But these were nothing like the original stone fortifications. Giustiniani personally commanded the defense at this critical point. For over an hour, he and his Genoese soldiers held the line. They fought with savage intensity, throwing back every attempt to penetrate the breach. The Janissaries would surge forward, clash with the defenders in brutal hand-to-hand combat, then be driven back by Giustiniani's counterattacks. But the defenders were at their breaking point. They had been fighting for 4 hours straight. They had no arrows. They had no more gunpowder. Many were wounded. All were exhausted beyond description. And then disaster struck. At approximately sunrise, Giustiniani was struck by a bolt from an Ottoman hand cannon. The projectile pierced his breastplate and drove deep into his chest. He fell, badly wounded. His men rushed to help him. He was conscious, but in terrible pain, and he knew the wound was mortal. He begged to be taken off the walls, to be brought to a ship in the harbor, so he could die at sea rather than in Ottoman captivity. His men carried him away, and when the defenders saw their commander being taken from the walls, panic spread along the line. Rumors flashed down the line that Giustiniani had abandoned them, that the foreigners were fleeing. It was not true, but in the chaos and terror of battle, truth did not matter. Morale collapsed. Emperor Constantine saw what was happening. He ran to the breach, trying to rally the men. He shouted to them to hold. He drew his sword and took Giustiniani's place at the barricade. For a few minutes, his presence stabilized the line. The defenders fought on. But the Janissaries sensed the wavering. They pressed harder. More and more of them poured through the breach. The fighting became desperate and confused. And then, on the northern end of the land walls, something terrible happened. A small postern gate, a minor door used by defenders to launch sorties, was left unlocked. Exactly how or why remains one of history's mysteries. Perhaps a defender fleeing in panic forgot to secure it. Perhaps it was sabotage. We will never know. But a group of about 50 Janissaries discovered the unlocked gate. They pushed through it and found themselves inside the walls, behind the Byzantine defenses. They did not try to fight. Instead, they ran to the nearest tower, climbed to its top, and planted the Ottoman flag. The sight of the Turkish banner flying from a tower inside the city sent a wave of panic through the defenders. The Turks were inside. The walls had been breached. Byzantine soldiers began to flee, streaming away from the walls toward the inner city or toward the harbor, hoping to escape by ship. The carefully organized defense collapsed into chaos. The Janissaries poured through the breaches and through the now open gates in an unstoppable flood. Emperor Constantine, seeing his men fleeing, seeing the Ottoman banners now flying from multiple towers, knowing that all was lost, made his final decision. He would not flee. He would not be captured. He would die as a Roman emperor should, fighting. He tore off his imperial insignia so the Ottomans would not know who he was, then drew his sword and turned to the handful of loyal guards still beside him and said simply, "The city is fallen, but I still live." Then he charged directly into the mass of advancing janissaries. He was never seen again.
With the emperor lost in the chaos of battle and the walls breached, organized resistance collapsed. Ottoman soldiers poured into Constantinople by the thousands. What followed was one of the most infamous sacks in history. Mehmed had made a promise to his army. Islamic law stated that if a city surrendered, it should be spared. But if a city resisted and was taken by force, the conquering army had the right to 3 days of looting. Constantinople had resisted. Now it would pay the price. The Ottoman soldiers spread through the city like a flood. They were looking for 3 things: gold, slaves, and anything valuable they could carry. Homes were broken into, churches were ransacked, people were dragged from their hiding places. The great church of Hagia Sophia, where thousands of civilians had taken refuge, believing it to be sanctuary, offered no protection. The Ottomans smashed down the doors. Inside, priests were conducting a final desperate service, praying for divine intervention. The soldiers cut them down at the altar. The civilians, packed into the church, were rounded up to be sold as slaves. Across the city, similar scenes played out. The Venetian and Genoese merchants who had fought alongside the Greeks tried to retreat to their ships. Some made it, many did not. Elderly people and children were killed if they could not walk, as they had no value as slaves. Young women and strong men were the most valuable prizes to be sold in the slave markets of the Ottoman Empire. The looting was systematic. Ottoman soldiers had been organized into units, each assigned a different district of the city. They went from house to house, palace to palace, church to church, stripping everything of value. Gold and silver religious vessels, ancient manuscripts, silk vestments, jewelry, anything portable and precious. But amid the horror, there were also moments of strange mercy. Mehmed had given strict orders that certain buildings were to be protected. The city's ancient libraries and their priceless collections of Greek and Roman manuscripts were to be preserved. Some Ottoman scholars, recognizing the value of these texts, quietly saved them. These manuscripts would later help spark the Renaissance in Italy as fleeing Greek scholars carried them west. By midday, the looting began to slow. The Ottoman soldiers, laden with plunder and driving columns of slaves, began to make their way back to their camps. Mehmed himself entered the city. He rode his horse through the streets to Hagia Sophia. When he entered the great church, he was struck by its beauty. The massive dome, the golden mosaics, the sheer scale of it. He ordered that it be immediately converted into a mosque. A muezzin was summoned. The first Islamic call to prayer echoed through the church that had been the heart of Orthodox Christianity for over 900 years. Mehmed then did something unexpected. He dismounted and picked up a handful of dust.
He sprinkled it over his turban as a gesture of humility before God. He issued a decree. The 3 days of looting were over. From this moment forward, Constantinople was under his protection. Any further violence would be punished. He also declared that Christians and Jews could continue to live in the city under his rule, practicing their religions as long as they paid a special tax. The Sultan had his prize, the queen of cities, the greatest city in the world, and he renamed it. It would no longer be Constantinople, it would be Istanbul, the center of a new empire, an Islamic empire that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean for the next 4 centuries. The Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of Rome. In the days following the conquest, one question haunted everyone. What had happened to Constantine the 11th, the last Byzantine emperor? He had been seen leading a final charge into the Ottoman lines. Then he had simply vanished. No body was found bearing imperial insignia. No one could say for certain whether he lived or died. Mehmed himself desperately wanted to know. If Constantine was dead, Mehmed wanted his body. If he was alive and hiding, Mehmed wanted him captured. Ottoman soldiers were ordered to search the battlefield, to examine every corpse. They found thousands of dead defenders, but none could be positively identified as the emperor. Some Greek witnesses claimed they had seen Constantine fall fighting near the St. Romanus Gate, his body trampled and lost among the countless dead. Others said he had escaped, that he had fled the city and was in hiding, waiting for the right moment to return. Mehmed offered a reward for information. Eventually, some Greek civilians came forward. They claimed they could identify the emperor's body by his distinctive purple boots, which only the Byzantine emperor was permitted to wear. They led Ottoman officials to a pile of corpses near the walls. There, they said, buried under dozens of other bodies, was Constantine. The body was recovered. The head was cut off and sent to Mehmed. The Sultan displayed it briefly as proof of his total victory, then had it buried with honor. He commissioned a tomb for Constantine, respecting him as a worthy enemy who had died defending his city. But many Greeks refused to believe Constantine was dead. Legends immediately began to spread. Some said an angel had appeared to the emperor at the moment of defeat, turning him to marble and hiding him in a secret cave beneath the city. There he would sleep until the day when Constantinople would be Christian again. Then he would awaken and reclaim his throne. This legend of the marble emperor persisted for centuries among Greeks living under Ottoman rule. It gave them hope during the darkest times. Even today, some believe that somewhere beneath the streets of Istanbul, the last emperor sleeps, waiting. The truth is simpler and sadder. Constantine died as he chose to die, fighting. He could have fled. He could have escaped to Italy and lived in exile, setting up a government in pretense as other deposed rulers did. But he chose to stay, to share the fate of his city and his people. His death marked the end of a line that stretched back over 1,000 years. Constantine I had founded Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire in 330 AD. Constantine XI died defending it in 1453 AD.
the empire that had been Rome, that had preserved the legacy of classical civilization through the Dark Ages, that had been the bulwark of Christianity against Islamic expansion for centuries, was gone. Historians often mark May 29th, 1453, as the end of the medieval age. With Constantinople's fall, the medieval world order collapsed. The Renaissance was beginning in Italy, fueled in part by Byzantine scholars fleeing east with their precious manuscripts. European explorers were preparing to sail west to find new routes to the Indies, which would lead to the Age of Discovery and the colonization of the Americas. One city, one siege, one day, and the entire world changed. The fall of Constantinople did not just end an empire, it transformed global history. And at the center of that transformation was a man who chose honor over survival, an emperor who died with his sword in his hand, defending walls that had stood for 1,000 years on the last day they would ever stand. In the weeks following the conquest, Mehmed set about transforming his prize into his capital of the Ottoman Empire. Istanbul, as it was now called, needed to be rebuilt and repopulated. The 3 days of looting had left much of the city damaged. Many buildings had been burned. The population, once numbering in the tens of thousands, had been drastically reduced by death, flight, and enslavement. Mehmed was pragmatic. He needed Istanbul to be a thriving city, not a ruin. He issued a decree inviting people of all religions to settle there. Muslims, Christians, and Jews were all welcome. He promised protection, economic opportunities, and religious freedom in exchange for loyalty to the Ottoman state. To encourage immigration, he forced resettlement. Families from conquered territories across the empire were ordered to move to Istanbul. Greek, Armenian, and Jewish communities were transplanted en masse. Within a few years, the city's population began to recover. Mehmed also began a massive building program. He converted major churches into mosques, including Hagia Sophia. He built new mosques, palaces, and bazaars. The old Byzantine palace, damaged and neglected, was abandoned. Instead, Mehmed built a new palace on a hill overlooking the city. This would become the Topkapi Palace, the center of Ottoman power for the next 4 centuries. But what of the treasures of Constantinople, the legendary wealth that had attracted conquerors for over 1,000 years? Much of it was gone. The 3 days of looting had dispersed an incalculable amount of gold, silver, precious gems, and art across the Ottoman Empire and beyond. Soldiers sold their plunder in markets from Anatolia to Egypt. The most precious items, the holy relics that Constantinople had collected over the centuries, had varied fates. Some were destroyed by soldiers who did not understand their value. Others were saved by Ottoman officials who recognized their worth, either as art or as diplomatic gifts. The most famous relic, the supposed crown of thorns worn by Christ, had already been sold by a bankrupt Byzantine emperor to Louis IX of France in the 13th century and was safely in Paris. Many ancient manuscripts and books survived. Ottoman scholars and collectors preserved them, understanding their value. Ironically, the Ottoman conquest helped save these texts. When Greek scholars fled west to Italy, they brought these manuscripts with them. These texts of ancient Greek philosophy, science, and literature helped fuel the Renaissance. Knowledge that might have been lost in the chaos of the fall was instead preserved and spread across Europe.
The strategic impact of Constantinople's fall was immediate and profound. The Ottomans now controlled the most important trade routes between Europe and Asia. Venice, Genoa, and other Italian trading powers that had grown rich on Eastern trade now had to negotiate with and pay tribute to the Ottoman Sultan. The increased cost and difficulty of the traditional trade routes motivated European nations to find alternative paths to the riches of India and China. Portugal led the way, sponsoring voyages down the coast of Africa, eventually rounding the Cape of Good Hope. Spain sponsored Columbus, who sailed west, hoping to reach the Indies, and instead stumbled upon the Americas. The fall of Constantinople directly contributed to the age of exploration. On the eastern Mediterranean, Ottoman power was now supreme. The empire would continue to expand, conquering Syria, Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, and pushing into Europe itself. Ottoman armies would reach the gates of Vienna. Their fleets would dominate the Mediterranean for over a century. But the city of Constantinople, now Istanbul, would never again be a Christian capital. The transformation was complete and permanent. The Queen of Cities had a new master, and that master would hold it for nearly 500 years until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I.
The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was not just the end of a city or an empire. It was a turning point in human history, the moment when the medieval world ended and the early modern world began. For 1,000 years, Constantinople had been the greatest city in Christendom. It was wealthier, more cultured, more sophisticated than any city in Western Europe. It had preserved the knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome through the Dark Ages. Its libraries contained manuscripts that no longer existed anywhere else. Its scholars studied philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine at a level Europe would not match for centuries. When the city fell, those scholars fled west. They went to Italy, to France, to wherever they could find refuge, and they brought their books with them. The rediscovery of classical knowledge, the study of ancient Greek texts that had been lost to the West, was one of the sparks that ignited the Renaissance. The fall of Constantinople directly contributed to the rebirth of classical learning in Europe. The conquest also had profound religious consequences. For Orthodox Christians, the fall of the city was an apocalyptic event. Constantinople was the new Rome, the protector of true Christianity. Its fall to Islam seemed to signal the end times. The Orthodox Church would survive under Ottoman rule, but it would never again have the same power or prestige. The center of Orthodox Christianity slowly shifted north to Moscow, whose princes began calling their city the Third Rome, the heir to Constantinople's spiritual legacy. For the Islamic world, the conquest was a triumph. The prophecy that Constantinople would one day be conquered by a righteous Muslim army had been fulfilled. Mehmed was celebrated as a great hero. He was given the title Fatih, the conqueror. His conquest legitimized the Ottoman Empire as the dominant power in the Islamic world, a position it would hold for centuries. The military lessons of the siege were equally profound. Constantinople had fallen to gunpowder. The great cannons that Mehmed used demonstrated that medieval fortifications, no matter how strong, could be destroyed by artillery. Within a few decades, castles and city walls across Europe were being redesigned to withstand cannon fire. The age of the castle was ending. The age of the gun had arrived. And then there is the city itself. Today, Istanbul is one of the great cities of the world,
a vibrant metropolis of over 15 million people, straddling 2 continents, a place where East meets West. The modern city is built on the bones of the ancient one. You can still see remnants of the Theodosian walls, those legendary fortifications that held for 1,000 years. You can still visit Hagia Sophia, no longer a mosque but a museum, its Christian mosaics visible again after centuries of being covered with plaster. You can stand on the walls where Constantine made his last stand. You can walk through the streets where Janissaries fought Byzantine defenders.
And so our long journey through the fall of Constantinople comes to an end. We have walked the walls of the greatest city in the medieval world. We have stood beside defenders who knew they faced impossible odds but refused to surrender. We have witnessed the arrival of the largest cannons the world had ever seen. We have heard the roar of 100,000 men attacking at dawn. We have seen the moment when the walls, unconquered for over 1,000 years, finally fell. We have stood beside an emperor who chose honor over survival, who died with his sword in his hand rather than flee or beg for mercy. We have witnessed the end of an empire that had stood for over 11 centuries, the last remnant of Rome finally extinguished. And we have seen how one city's fall changed the entire world, how it sent scholars fleeing west with ancient manuscripts that would help spark the Renaissance, how it motivated explorers to sail into unknown oceans, leading to the discovery of new continents, how it demonstrated that gunpowder had changed warfare forever, that medieval fortifications were obsolete, that a new age had begun. It is a story of endings and beginnings. The medieval world died on May 29, 1453, but in its death the modern world was born. As you close your eyes now, as you drift into sleep, let the story settle gently in your mind. Do not dwell on the violence, on the tragedy of the thousands who died. Instead, remember the courage, the defenders who stood on those walls, knowing they would lose, but fought anyway. The emperor who chose to die rather than abandon his people. The ordinary citizens who took up arms to defend their home. Remember that empires are temporary, but human courage is eternal. That cities may fall, but the stories of those who defended them live on. That even in defeat there can be honor and dignity. Constantinople is gone, Byzantium is gone, the Roman Empire in its final Eastern form is gone, but Istanbul remains, built on the same land, overlooking the same waters, connecting the same continents. The city endures as cities do, outlasting empires and emperors alike. If you ever have the chance to visit Istanbul, stand on the ancient walls, look out over the Golden Horn, walk through Hagia Sophia, touch the stones that Constantine's defenders touched, feel the weight of history, and remember the last day of Constantinople when an empire ended and the world changed forever. Sleep now, rest peacefully. Let the images of marble walls and golden domes, of brave defenders and a dying emperor fade gently into your dreams. Let the story become part of your unconscious mind, a reminder that every ending is also a beginning, that what seems permanent can change in a single day, and that human courage in the face of inevitable defeat is something to be honored and remembered. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. Thank you for listening to the story of Constantinople's final day. If you enjoyed this, please consider liking the video and subscribing for more stories from the past. And please leave a comment.
Tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight. Tell me what you thought of this story. I read every comment, and I truly appreciate hearing from you. Until our next journey into history, I wish you peaceful dreams and a restful night. Good night.